My name is Athena Reynolds, and I am 33 years old, an age where most people are beginning to feel the solid ground of their own identity beneath their feet. Yet I have spent my entire existence walking on a thin crust of ice over a freezing lake of secrets. I have spent the last 11 years of my life as a senior certified public accountant at a top-tier firm in downtown Chicago, grinding through 60-hour work weeks, meticulously balancing the ledgers of multi-million-dollar corporations, and earning a rigorous salary of $142,000 a year, all while being treated like an unwanted tenant in the very family I supported. But my mother, Virginia Reynolds, a woman of 67 years who wears her bitterness like a designer perfume, decided to end the charade during the most public moment possible. We were standing in the grand ballroom of the historic Oakwood Manor, a venue that costs $6,000 just to reserve for an afternoon, surrounded by 47 relatives who were dressed in their Sunday best and clutching glasses of chilled Veuve Clicquot. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the faint metallic scent of the lake breeze, but the atmosphere turned toxic the second Virginia stepped up to the podium. She gripped a $249 Shure wireless microphone, her knuckles turning white against the matte black finish, and her voice didn't tremble as she looked me directly in the eye and told me that since I was never really hers, she was done pretending to love me. She announced to the gasping room that she was leaving the entire 120-acre Reynolds estate, the heritage farmhouse with its wraparound porch and mahogany interiors, and the $412,000 in liquid savings entirely to my brother James. She said I was just a debt she had to pay to Harold, my late father, and in that single shattering sentence, she erased 33 years of my history as if she were simply deleting a line on a spreadsheet. But to understand how we reached this point of absolute betrayal, let me take you back to the morning of that day, a day that started with the mundane sounds of a life I thought was secure. I woke up at 5 in the morning in my apartment, which I keep at a precise 68 degrees, the humming of the central air conditioning the only sound in the pre-dawn quiet. I sat at my glass-topped desk, a minimalist piece from Herman Miller that cost nearly $2,000, and sipped a cup of Nespresso Vertuo coffee, the bitter caffeine hitting my tongue as I reviewed my mother's estate taxes for the third time that week. I had always been the one to handle the finances, the one to ensure the property taxes on the farmhouse were paid to the county collector, and the one to manage the investment portfolio that kept James in his $24,000 per year private boarding school tuition and his frequent trips to the coast. James is 24, a golden boy with a penchant for high-end fashion and zero interest in the grit of actual work, yet he was always the one Virginia looked at with eyes full of light. I was the shadow, the utility, the person who made sure the lights stayed on and the bank accounts stayed black. I remember looking at my reflection in the polished surface of my MacBook Pro, noting the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could fully hide, and feeling a strange, cold dread in my stomach that I dismissed as mere exhaustion from tax season. The drive to the Reynolds estate takes exactly 42 minutes from the city if you take the I-94, and I made the trip in my 2023 graphite gray Audi A6, a car I bought with my own hard-earned bonuses and which I keep meticulously clean. The leather smelled of sandalwood, and the digital dashboard showed it was exactly 74 degrees outside when I pulled up the long gravel driveway lined with ancient oaks that give the manor its name. The farmhouse is a sprawling piece of architecture, a testament to 5 generations of Reynolds history, with a roof that I had personally paid $22,000 to have re-shingled just 2 years ago. I stepped out of the car, my heels crunching on the white gravel, and saw James standing on the porch, wearing a $400 Ralph Lauren linen suit and holding a crystal tumbler of something amber-colored. He didn't wave. He just watched me, a smirk playing on his lips that I should have recognized as a warning. Inside, the house was a hive of activity, with caterers from a high-end agency in the city bustling about, setting up trays of smoked salmon crostini and miniature quiches that cost $35 per dozen. My mother was in the parlor, draped in a silk dress the color of a bruised plum, her hair perfectly coiffed by a stylist she'd flown in for the morning. She didn't look at me when I entered, only instructed me to check the seating charts one last time to ensure that her sister, my Aunt Martha, wasn't placed anywhere near the bar. The event was supposed to be a celebration of the family's legacy, a gathering to honor the memory of my father, Harold, who passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. He was a man of few words but deep pockets, a man who I thought loved me, though looking back I see the gaps in his affection that I was too desperate to fill. I spent the afternoon playing the perfect daughter, greeting cousins I hadn't seen in years, explaining my work in the city, and nodding politely as people commented on how much I looked like my father. Every time someone said that, Virginia's eyes would flash with a cold, sharp light, a look I always interpreted as grief, but which I now realize was pure, unadulterated resentment. By 3 in the afternoon, the sun was casting long, jagged shadows across the ballroom floor, and the heat of 47 bodies in the room was beginning to overwhelm the antique ventilation system. My mother took the stage, and the room fell silent. The only sound the clinking of a fork against a dessert plate and the distant buzz of a lawnmower from a neighboring property. She began her speech with a tribute to Harold, her voice smooth and practiced, but then she shifted, her tone hardening into something jagged and dangerous. She didn't follow the notes I had helped her draft on her iPad. Instead, she reached for that microphone and began to dismantle my life with surgical precision. She told the room that I had always been a burden, a reminder of a contract she never wanted to sign, and that the blood in my veins wasn't the blood of the Reynolds line at all. She spoke of a secret arrangement, a debt of honor between her and Harold that involved my very existence, and as she spoke, the relatives began to whisper, their eyes darting toward me with a mixture of pity and predatory curiosity. I stood there, my hands clenched so tightly at my sides that my nails drew blood from my palms, feeling the world I had built on a foundation of hard work and loyalty crumble into dust. James didn't look surprised. He just leaned against a pillar, sipping his drink, the heir to a fortune he hadn't lifted a finger to earn. The weight of her words felt like physical blows, the numbers she recited, the 120 acres, the farmhouse, the $412,000, ringing in my ears like a funeral knell. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed up until 3 in the morning, my eyes burning from the glow of spreadsheets, all to ensure that this woman and her favored son never had to worry about a single bill. I thought of the $500 grocery orders I placed for her every week, the $12,000 Mediterranean cruise I had bought her for her 65th birthday, and the way I had quietly handled the legal fees when James got into trouble with his speeding tickets in his $60,000 Mustang. All of it had been a lie. I was never a daughter. I was a transaction, a line item that had finally been settled. When she finished, she didn't offer a hug or a private explanation. She simply turned off the microphone with a sharp click, the feedback echoing through the silent ballroom, and walked off the stage toward James, leaving me standing in the center of the room like a statue of a girl who no longer existed. The cousins and aunts began to move, the sound of their whispers rising like the hum of insects, and I realized that in their eyes I had been demoted from a family member to a stranger in an instant. I looked at the Shure microphone sitting on the podium, a mundane object that had just been used to execute my social and emotional standing, and I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. If I was a debt that had been paid, then I owed them nothing more. No more 60-hour weeks to cover their excesses, no more managing their taxes, no more playing the role of the dutiful, invisible provider. I turned and walked out of the Oakwood Manor, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished hardwood, ignoring the hands that reached out to touch my arm and the voices that called my name. I stepped out into the late afternoon air, which was now heavy with the scent of rain and damp earth. I walked to my Audi, the car that I owned entirely, and I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, listening to the ticking of the engine cooling down. I looked at the farmhouse in the distance, the white paint glowing in the fading light, and realized that while they had the land and the money, they had no idea how to keep it. They didn't know the passwords to the accounts, they didn't know the schedule for the property maintenance, and they certainly didn't know that the $412,000 in savings was tied up in a trust that required my signature as the executor of Harold's estate, a detail Virginia had clearly overlooked in her haste to humiliate me. As I pulled out of the driveway, the gravel spraying beneath my tires, I felt a strange sense of liberation. My name is Athena, and for 33 years, I lived a life defined by people who saw me as a commodity. But as the gates of the Reynolds estate vanished in my rearview mirror, I knew that the debt was indeed paid, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the ledger. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a 120-acre estate or a sum of money in a bank account. Family is the truth you tell when no one is watching, and the people who stay when the stage lights go dark. My mother thought she was casting me out into the cold, but she didn't realize that I was the one who had been keeping the fire burning all along, and now I was taking the matches with me. The financial landscape of the Reynolds household was not merely a series of disparate bank accounts or varying levels of success. It was a yawning chasm of systemic inequality that had been meticulously engineered over decades. My brother James, who is 35 and has never truly understood the concept of a balanced ledger or the visceral weight of a hard-earned dollar, lived a life of subsidized luxury that was as gaudy as it was unearned. He spent his afternoons cruising the winding back roads of our county in a 2023 Velocity Blue Ford F-150 Raptor, a high-performance machine with a sticker price of $78,000 that was bought and paid for by what my mother vaguely referred to as family loans. These were not the kind of loans one might find in a professional accounting firm like the one where I spend my 60-hour weeks. There were no promissory notes, no amortization schedules, and certainly no interest rates attached to these disbursements of wealth. They were effectively gifts wrapped in the thin, transparent veil of temporary assistance, designed to insulate James from the consequences of his own chronic lethargy. While he felt the roar of that 450-horsepower engine beneath him, I navigated the world in a 2019 Subaru Outback in magnetite gray metallic, a reliable but unpretentious vehicle that carried a $412 monthly payment I meticulously factored into my strict personal budget every single month. My car smelled of the cheap black coffee I drank to stay awake during late-night audits and the faint scent of rain from the city, whereas the interior of James's truck always smelled of expensive leather and the arrogance of a man who knows he will never be asked to pay his own way. The disparity deepened when one looked at our professional trajectories and the capital injected into them, as James was the recipient of repeated infusions of seed money for a series of 3 spectacularly failed startups that totaled $115,000 in lost capital. One was a specialized app for high-end watch collectors that crashed within 4 months. Another was a boutique organic fertilizer company that never sold a single bag. And the third was a tech consulting firm that seemed to exist only so he could print business cards with the title of CEO. Each time he failed, Virginia was there with a checkbook and a sympathetic pat on the back, treating his incompetence as a mere string of bad luck that required more Reynolds money to rectify. In stark contrast, my journey through the halls of higher education was defined by the crushing weight of $62,000 in student loans, a debt I carried like a physical burden through my undergraduate and master's degrees. I worked 2 jobs, one as a night shift data entry clerk and another as a weekend tutor, just to keep the interest from compounding into an insurmountable mountain, while James spent his college years, which took him 6 years to complete, vacationing on the family's dime. I remember the exact texture of the paper when I made my final loan payment, a moment of triumph that I celebrated alone in my apartment with a $20 bottle of wine, knowing that not a single cent of that $62,000 had come from the 120-acre estate I was currently being evicted from. The farmhouse itself was the physical manifestation of my father's soul, a structure Harold Reynolds had built with his own calloused hands 40 years ago, long before the bitterness had fully poisoned the well of our family. He had been a man of immense physical capability and quiet pride, and as a child, I watched him measure every joist and hoist every 2x4 beam into place with a precision that bordered on the religious. He used high-quality Douglas fir for the framing, and I can still remember the sharp, clean scent of sawdust that clung to his flannel shirts when he came in for dinner, his hands stained with the grease of the machinery and the red clay of our land. Every square inch of that house, from the mahogany banisters to the hand-laid stone fireplace in the great room, was a testament to his labor and his belief that he was building a sanctuary for his lineage. He was the one who taught me that a foundation must be level and deep if the house is to stand against the storms that roll in from the coast, a lesson I applied to my career in accounting, but which my mother and brother seemed to have forgotten the moment his heart stopped beating. My father died 5 years ago at exactly 8:12 in the morning on a Tuesday, a day when the sky was a flat, unblinking gray and the air was thick with the humidity of an impending thunderstorm. I remember the digital clock on the wall of the intensive care unit flickering as the seconds ticked toward that final, devastating moment, and I remember the way the silence felt after the machines stopped their rhythmic chirping. Since that Tuesday, Virginia has been engaged in a cold, calculated campaign of historical revisionism, methodically erasing my presence from the farmhouse as if I were a stain she was trying to bleach out of the floorboards. It started with the small things, like moving the framed photograph of my CPA certification ceremony from the mantel to a side table, and then eventually into a cardboard box. Now, my entire 33-year history in that house has been compressed into a 12-square-foot hallway closet located behind the laundry room, a cramped, dark space where my childhood trophies, my high school yearbooks, and the few photos I have of me and my father are stacked in dusty piles. Walking past that closet is a daily exercise in humiliation, a reminder that in the eyes of the woman who birthed me, I am less valuable than the linen she keeps in the upstairs hall or the overpriced hunting gear James stores in the mudroom. She has replaced the images of my milestones with large, gilded frames containing professional portraits of James looking stoic on the porch or posed in front of his raptor, creating a curated gallery of his unearned life while my reality is tucked away behind a slatted wooden door. The injustice of it vibrates in the air between us, a low-frequency hum of resentment that has reached a breaking point. Every time I see the $2,400 Persian rug in the entryway that I paid to have professionally cleaned, or the high-efficiency HVAC system I spent $9,000 to install when the old one failed during a record-breaking heat wave, I am reminded of the sheer scale of the theft. I have been the architect of their comfort, the silent engine that kept the Reynolds estate from sliding into financial ruin after my father's death, managing the property taxes that cost $14,000 a year, and ensuring the insurance premiums were paid on time to the penny. Virginia's announcement at the Oakwood Manor was not a sudden impulse. It was the final stroke in a painting she had been working on for 5 years, a masterpiece of exclusion and cruelty. She stood there with that sure microphone, the same woman who had called me 3 weeks prior to ask if I could help her navigate the online portal for her Medicare Part B premiums because she couldn't understand the interface, and told the world I was a debt to be settled. The irony is as thick as the humidity on the morning my father died. She relies on my professional expertise to keep her world spinning, yet she views me as a transactional error that needs to be corrected. James, with his $78,000 truck and his failed startups, is the heir because he represents the version of the Reynolds name she wants to project, leisured, wealthy, and untouchable. I, with my student loans and my $412 car payment and my 60-hour weeks, am a reminder of the grit, the labor, and the uncomfortable truths that she would rather keep locked in a 12-square-foot closet. As I stand in the wake of her words, the 120-acre estate looks different to me now. It no longer looks like a home or a legacy, but like a crime scene where my identity was murdered in front of 47 witnesses. The farmhouse, with its beams that my father painstakingly leveled, feels like it is leaning, as if the moral rot at its center is finally beginning to compromise the structural integrity of the Douglas fir joists. I think about the savings account. That $412,000 that she so boldly promised to James, and I feel a cold, professional satisfaction blooming in my chest. I know the exact structure of the trust my father left behind. I know the clauses, the stipulations, and the legal hurdles that Virginia, in her arrogance and her ignorance of finance, has completely ignored. She thinks she has handed James the keys to the kingdom, but she has really only handed him a map to a labyrinth that I designed. Family might be who stays when the truth comes out, but in this house the truth is a debt that is finally coming due, and I am the only one who knows how to collect it. For 33 years, I was the girl in the closet, the tenant in her own life. But as the sun sets on the Reynolds estate today, I realize that you cannot erase the person who holds the ledger without expecting the entire system to collapse under the weight of its own lies. The betrayal did not come as a whisper or a private conversation behind closed doors, but rather as a public execution of my identity during the Reynolds annual family reunion, an event that had always been the cornerstone of our social calendar in Millbrook. The thermometer on the shaded porch of the farmhouse read exactly 86 degrees, and the air was a thick, stagnant soup of humidity, heavy with the cloying scent of hickory smoke from the industrial-sized charcoal grill and the sharp, floral bite of Virginia's $85 Chanel No. 5 perfume. I remember the way the sweat felt like a cold film on the back of my neck as I stood near the buffet table, holding a flimsy paper plate weighted down by a scoop of store-bought potato salad and a piece of blackened chicken that cost about $4 per pound at the local butcher. My mother, Virginia, was positioned at the head table like a queen presiding over a crumbling court, draped in a navy blue church dress made of a stiff, unforgiving polyester blend that she had purchased for $300 at a boutique in the city. She stood up, her movements fluid and practiced, and the chatter of 47 relatives died down until the only sound left was the distant, rhythmic buzzing of a cicada in the ancient oak trees. She didn't use the Shure microphone this time. Her voice was naturally sharp enough to cut through the heavy afternoon air as she looked at the crowd and announced that I was the mistake my father, Harold, had forced her to raise against her will. In that singular, devastating moment, she didn't just reject me. She began a calculated assassination of my father's character, painting the most honest and hard-working man in Millbrook as a common philanderer who had supposedly brought a stray child home and demanded she be integrated into the family. She spoke with a rehearsed venom, her eyes never once softening as she described the alleged betrayal of her marriage, turning my father's legacy into a sordid tale of infidelity and secret shames. My father, the man who had built every joist and 2x4 beam of our home with his own calloused hands, was being rewritten as a liar by the woman who had lived off his sweat for 4 decades. I looked over at James, my 35-year-old brother who had always been the beneficiary of my silence and my labor, and I saw him leaning back in a cheap green plastic folding chair that groaned under his weight. He was casually sipping a $2 Bud Light, the aluminum can sweating in the 86-degree heat, and he didn't even blink as our mother dismantled my existence. There was no shock on his face, no protective instinct, only a dull, glazed look of satisfaction that told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't just been a witness to this plan, he had been an architect of it, helping Virginia navigate the complex legal waters of disinheritance and drafting the very documents that sought to strip me of my name and my home. The realization that my own brother had sat across from me at dinner for months, knowing that he was helping to legally erase me, felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs. I looked down at my paper plate, at the yellow, mustard-tinged potato salad that was slowly warming in the sun, and I realized the absurdity of my presence in that space. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of a seat at a table that was never truly mine, working 60-hour weeks as a senior CPA to ensure their financial stability while they plotted my exile. I didn't scream, and I didn't demand an explanation, because the look in Virginia's eyes told me that she had been waiting for this day since the moment Harold's heart stopped at 8:12 on that Tuesday morning 5 years ago. I simply set my plate down on the edge of the wooden picnic table, the plastic fork clattering against the wood with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the sudden silence of the backyard. I turned away from the head table, away from the navy blue dress and the Chanel No. 5 and the 47 pairs of eyes that were now staring at me with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. I walked across the lawn, my heels sinking slightly into the parched earth that I had personally paid a landscaping crew $4,000 to aerate and seed just the previous spring. I reached my 2019 Subaru Outback, the car I was still paying $412 a month for, and the interior was a sweltering oven after sitting in the unshaded driveway all afternoon. I started the engine, the digital display showing the outside temperature as a blistering 88 degrees now, and I reversed out of the gravel driveway without looking back at the farmhouse or the 120 acres of land that I now knew were a prison of lies. The drive back to the city was exactly 114 miles, a journey that took me through the rolling hills of the countryside and onto the sterile, gray expanse of the interstate. I drove every single one of those 114 miles in a silence so absolute it felt heavy, refusing to turn on the radio or the climate control until I was miles away from the smell of hickory smoke. My mind was a forensic lab, dissecting every memory of my father, looking for the cracks in the story Virginia had just told, trying to reconcile the man who taught me about structural integrity with the man she described as a cheat. The city skyline began to rise up in the distance, a jagged silhouette of steel and glass that represented the life I had built for myself outside of the Reynolds shadow, and for the first time in 33 years, I felt the true scale of the financial and emotional theft that had occurred. While I was worrying about the $62,000 in student loans I had finally cleared, James was drinking $2 beers and signing off on the theft of a $412,000 savings account. The farmhouse, which Harold had constructed with such care, now felt like a hollow shell, a monument to a man whose memory was being desecrated by the very people he had worked to provide for. As I pulled into my apartment complex and parked my Subaru, the engine ticking as it cooled in the quiet garage, I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me that was more powerful than any grief. Virginia thought she had won by revealing the secret of my birth and casting me out of the 120-acre estate, but she had made a fundamental error in judgment regarding my professional capabilities. She saw me as a mistake, a stray, a debt to be paid, but she forgot that I am a woman who makes her living by finding the errors that others try to hide in the fine print. I sat in my apartment, the air conditioning humming at its steady 68 degrees, and I opened my laptop to look at the digital copies of the trust documents I had managed for my father before his death. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the clauses and the legal definitions, my CPA brain overriding the emotional turmoil of the afternoon. I knew that Virginia's navy blue dress and her $85 perfume were bought with money that didn't belong to her yet, and I knew that James's $78,000 Raptor was collateral in a game he didn't understand how to play. The 114 miles I had driven was not an escape. It was a tactical withdrawal. I thought about my father's hands, the way they looked covered in the dust of the 2x4 beams he used to build our home, and I knew that he wouldn't have left me defenseless against a woman like Virginia. There is a specific kind of power in being the one who is underestimated, the one who is pushed into a 12-square-foot hallway closet and told they don't matter. You see things from the shadows that the people in the spotlight never notice, like the fact that the legal disinheritance James helped draft was based on a version of the family deed that hadn't been updated since 1992. The silence of my apartment was a stark contrast to the chaotic betrayal of the reunion, and as I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, I realized that the debt Virginia spoke of was far from settled. If I was a mistake, I was a very expensive one for her to make, because I held the keys to the very kingdom she was trying to hand to her golden son. I thought about the 47 relatives who had watched me walk away, wondering how many of them knew the truth, and how many were just there for the free catering and the spectacle of a family falling apart. Family isn't the navy dress you wear to church, or the 120-acre estate your father built. Family is the integrity of the foundation, and the Reynolds Foundation was currently riddled with termites of their own making. I had spent 11 years balancing other people's books, ensuring that every cent was accounted for and every tax law was followed to the letter. And now I was going to apply that same meticulous, cold-blooded precision to my own life. The girl who was moved to the hallway closet was gone, and in her place was a 33-year-old woman with a $142,000 salary and a deep understanding of how to dismantle a financial empire brick by brick. As the sun finally set over the city, casting long orange shadows across my living room, I closed my laptop and felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal was complete, the lines were drawn, and the 114 miles of silence had given me the one thing Virginia and James could never take away: the truth of my own worth. They could have the farmhouse and the 120 acres and the savings account for now, but they didn't realize that a house built on a lie cannot stand, no matter how many 2x4 beams hold it up. I am Athena Reynolds, and while I may have been brought home like a stray, I was the only one in that family who ever actually learned how to build something that lasts. The debt wasn't mine to pay, it was theirs to owe, and I was going to make sure that when the bill finally arrived, they wouldn't have a single cent left to their names. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I looked out at the city lights, I knew that I was finally the only one left standing on solid ground. The city outside my window was a desolate expanse of orange streetlights and shifting shadows as I sat in my kitchen at precisely 3:45 in the morning, the blue light from my laptop screen reflecting off the polished granite of my countertop. My apartment was silent except for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of a lone siren somewhere on the Kennedy Expressway, but my mind was operating with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a forensic auditor. Throughout my career as a senior CPA, I have learned that feelings are volatile and unreliable, but a paper trail is a permanent record of the truth that no amount of navy blue church dresses or Chanel No. 5 can ever truly erase. Virginia had stood before 47 relatives and proclaimed that I was not real family because of my blood, a statement designed to cast me out into the dark. But as I scrolled through the digital archives of my own memory, I realized that she had made a catastrophic tactical error by inviting a professional investigator to look into the Reynolds lineage. I closed my eyes for a moment and focused on a specific photograph I had found in a dusty shoebox in that 12-square-foot hallway closet years ago, a glossy 4x6 print from the spring of 1988 that featured a company picnic for my father's construction firm. In the background of that photo, Virginia was standing noticeably too close to a junior architect named Neil Whitfield, a man with a distinctively sharp, square jawline and a height that towered over the rest of the staff. The physical discrepancies in our family had always been treated as a quirky genetic lottery, but through the lens of my current isolation, they began to look like a smoking gun in a cold case. My father, Harold, had been a sturdy, grounded man who stood 5'9" with a rounded build and a soft, approachable face that reflected his gentle nature. Yet his golden son James had grown into a 6'1" specimen of athletic vanity, with a skeletal structure that bore absolutely no resemblance to the man who built our farmhouse. James possessed the same square jaw and deep-set eyes as the man in the 1988 photograph, a realization that hit me with the force of a physical blow as I compared a digitized version of that old picnic photo to a recent social media post of James standing next to his $78,000 Ford Raptor. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the keys of my MacBook Pro as I pulled up my Ancestry database, a tool I had used periodically to map out the Reynolds history for a family tree project that Virginia had eventually told me to abandon. I navigated to a shared link from 3 years ago when James's wife, Sarah, had bought him a DNA kit as a novelty Christmas gift, a kit that James had uploaded to the public database in a fit of narcissistic curiosity to see if he had any royal European ancestors. I had saved his profile ID back then out of a habit for data retention, and now that string of alphanumeric characters felt like the combination to a safe that Virginia thought was buried deep beneath the floorboards of the 120-acre estate. To confirm the theory that was forming in the cold, calculated part of my brain, I reached into the drawer where I keep my medical supplies and pulled out a fresh $99 DNA testing kit I had purchased months ago but never used. The plastic tube felt cold and clinical in my hand as I gathered the saliva needed for the sample, a mundane act that felt like signing a death warrant for the lies that had governed my life for 33 years. I spat into the tube, the liquid hitting the bottom with a quiet sound that echoed in the sterile silence of my kitchen. And then I snapped the cap shut, hearing the distinctive click that signaled the chemical preservative had been released into the vial. I didn't feel sadness or a sense of loss. I felt the grim satisfaction of a hunter who has finally found the tracks of a predator that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. I looked at the clock on my stove, which glowed a bright neon green, 4:05 in the morning. I knew that every second I waited was a second that Virginia and James spent celebrating their perceived victory, likely sitting in the farmhouse and drinking the expensive scotch my father had saved for a special occasion while they planned how to spend the $412,000 in savings. I grabbed my keys and my trench coat, the fabric rustling in the quiet hallway as I headed down to the garage to my 2019 Subaru Outback. The engine turned over with a confident purr, and I drove through the deserted streets of Chicago toward the 24-hour post office branch near the main sorting facility, a massive concrete structure that hummed with the labor of people who, like me, worked while the rest of the world slept. The air outside was crisp, smelling of lake water and exhaust, and as I walked up to the heavy metal drop box at exactly 4:20 in the morning, I felt a strange sense of alignment with the universe. I slid the padded envelope containing my DNA sample into the slot, hearing the heavy thud as it landed among thousands of other letters and packages, each one a secret or a story traveling toward a destination. As I walked back to my car, the sky in the east was beginning to turn a bruised purple, the first hint of a dawn that would eventually expose everything Virginia tried to keep in the shadows. I realized then that while Virginia had spent her life managing appearances, she had never learned how to manage reality, and she certainly hadn't accounted for a daughter who viewed life as a series of audits rather than a series of stories. If James was the biological son of Neil Whitfield, then the legal foundation of the entire Reynolds estate was built on sand, and the 120 acres of land that my father had sweated over belonged to a man who had been cuckolded in his own home. More importantly, if my father had known the truth, and the forensic trail of his last will and testament suggested he might have had his suspicions, then the trust he established was not a gift to Virginia and James, but a trap designed to be sprung by the only person he truly trusted with the numbers. I thought about the $412,000, a sum that represented a lifetime of Harold's frugality and hard work, and I knew that James would never see a single penny of it if my DNA matched the Reynolds markers that James's profile conspicuously lacked. The drive back to my apartment was punctuated by the rhythmic clicking of my turn signal, a sound that felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. My name is Athena, and for 11 years I have been the senior CPA who ensured that everyone else's accounts were balanced, but now I was finally balancing my own. Virginia had called me a debt to be paid to Harold, but the irony was that I was the only asset Harold actually had that wasn't a lie or a biological counterfeit. I arrived back at my apartment as the sun began to hit the glass of the skyscrapers downtown, turning the city into a forest of gold and steel, and I went straight back to my desk to begin the digital portion of my investigation. I started pulling up land deeds, historical tax records for the construction company from the late 80s, and the employment records of one Neil Whitfield, who I discovered had moved to Arizona in 1990 with a sudden infusion of cash that looked suspiciously like a payoff. Every detail I uncovered was another 2x4 beam in the structure of their undoing, a structure I was building with the same precision my father had used to frame the farmhouse 40 years ago. I thought about the 12-square-foot hallway closet where my life had been stashed, and I realized that Virginia hadn't just been hiding my photos. She had been hiding her fear of the truth I represented. I was the one who looked like Harold, the one who inherited his obsession with integrity and his quiet, relentless work ethic, while James was merely a 6'1" monument to a betrayal that was about to be national news in our small town of Millbrook. The $99 plastic tube was now on a truck or a plane, carrying the biological proof that would dismantle a 35-year-old deception, and as I sipped a fresh cup of coffee, I felt the weight of the last 33 years begin to lift. I didn't need their farmhouse or their 120 acres to know my worth, but I was going to ensure that the Reynolds name was returned to its rightful owner, the memory of my father, rather than being used as a shield for a woman who didn't know the meaning of the word family. Family is not the blood you claim to have. It is the truth you are willing to stand by when the world is at its darkest. At 4:20 in the morning, under the flickering fluorescent lights of a post office, I had stood by my truth, and now I just had to wait for the science to catch up to the numbers. The chasm in the Reynolds house was about to swallow the golden sun and the matriarch who had built her throne on a mountain of lies, and I would be the one standing on the edge, holding the ledger and watching the figures finally move into the red. I went to the window and looked out at the waking city, feeling a cold, diamond-sharp peace settle over me, because I knew that in the world of forensics, the truth doesn't care about your feelings, and it certainly doesn't care about your legacy. It only cares about the trail you leave behind. And Virginia Reynolds had left a trail that led straight to her own destruction. The digital arsenal that would eventually level the 120-acre Reynolds estate arrived exactly 12 days after I stood in the cold, fluorescent light of that 24-hour post office, a period of time that felt like an eternity spent underwater, while the rest of the world continued to breathe oblivious air. I found myself sitting in the high-altitude silence of my lawyer's office at Greer and Associates, located on the 44th floor of a steel and glass skyscraper in the heart of Chicago's Loop, where the air was climate-controlled to a perfect 69 degrees and smelled of expensive furniture polish and the bitter roasted aroma of $10 a cup espresso from a Jura machine in the lobby. My attorney, Marcus Greer, a man who charged $650 an hour to dismantle lives with surgical precision, sat across from me behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark mahogany, his hands steady as he pulled up the encrypted file that contained the biological wreckage of my mother's 35-year-old deception. The results were not just a set of data points or a collection of centimorgans, they were a digital execution, a series of percentages that performed a cold-blooded autopsy on the lies Virginia had used to poison my life and my father's memory. As I stared at the high-resolution monitor, the numbers began to scream the truth that the Reynolds family reunion had tried to bury under hickory smoke and navy blue polyester. My DNA match to my first cousin Rachel, the daughter of my father's brother, came back at a solid 12.4%, which is the undeniable genetic signature of a biological niece, proving beyond any shadow of a legal or scientific doubt that I am Harold Reynolds's true-born daughter. However, the real devastation lay in the next line of the report, a line that felt like a localized earthquake centered directly under the farmhouse in Millbrook, as the DNA match between me and my supposed brother James was recorded at a staggering 0.8%. In the objective, unblinking eyes of science, James and I are complete strangers, two individuals who happen to share a roof and a dinner table, but who do not share a single meaningful strand of the Reynolds legacy. James is not a Reynolds, he never was a Reynolds, and the 6'1" frame and square jaw he inherited were not a gift from a distant ancestor, but the direct biological inheritance of Neil Whitfield, the junior architect from the 1988 company picnic photo. The revelation hit me with a clarity so sharp, it felt like a physical incision, exposing the true nature of Virginia's cruelty over the last 3 decades. She hadn't been sacrificing her happiness or her dignity to raise a stray child my father had forced upon her. She had been using me as a human shield, a living distraction designed to hide her own 35-year-old affair while she systematically slandered a dead man's name to justify her own resentment. Every time she called me a mistake, every time she moved my belongings into that 12-square-foot hallway closet, and every time she treated me like a tenant in my own home, she was projecting her own guilt and her own biological fraud onto the only person in the house who actually belonged there. I sat there in that mahogany-lined office, sipping the expensive espresso that now tasted like ash, and I realized the sheer scale of the financial and emotional theft Virginia and James had attempted to finalize at the Oakwood Manor. They had stood before 47 relatives and painted my father, Harold, the man who spent 40 years ensuring every joist and 2x4 beam of our home was level, as a philanderer, all while the real evidence of a betrayal sat right there in the room, leaning back in a folding chair and sipping a $2 Bud Light. Virginia had attempted to disinherit me and hand a $412,000 savings account and a 120-acre estate to a man who had no legal or biological claim to any of it, effectively trying to complete a 35-year-long con against the man she claimed to have loved. Marcus Greer looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression neutral, but his eyes tracking the way my hands remained perfectly still on the leather armrests of the chair, and he asked me if I was ready to proceed with the filing of the probate challenge. I didn't need to answer immediately because the numbers on the screen were already doing the talking for me, spelling out a narrative of greed and deception that would make a seasoned forensic auditor like myself blush. The irony of the situation was a heavy, suffocating blanket. For years, I had carried the shame of being told I was a burden, a debt that needed to be paid, while I was the one paying the $14,000 property taxes and the $9,000 HVAC bills that kept their comfortable lie afloat. I had worked 60-hour weeks to earn my $142,000 salary, part of which I had consistently funneled back into the estate to ensure my mother lived in the luxury she felt was her birthright, only to be discarded the moment she thought she had secured the bag for her golden, counterfeit son. James's $78,000 Ford Raptor was not just a vehicle. It was a monument to unearned privilege built on the back of my father's labor and my own professional grind. As I sat in that quiet office, I thought about the 12-square-foot closet and the dusty trophies of a life Virginia tried to erase, and I felt a cold, diamond-hard resolve settle into my bones. The $85 Chanel No. 5 she wore was a mask for the rot beneath, and the navy blue church dress was a costume for a woman who had spent half her life lying to the man who provided everything for her. My father died at 8:12 on a Tuesday morning, and I now wonder if he went to his grave with the weight of her secret, or if his meticulous nature had led him to leave behind the very tools I was now using to dismantle her empire. Marcus flipped through a stack of documents I had provided, the trust agreements, the land deeds from 1992, and the financial records showing the $115,000 in seed money James had squandered. And he noted that the legal definition of an heir in my father's original trust was very specific. It didn't just say children, it said biological descendants of the Reynolds bloodline, a phrase that Virginia had clearly skimmed over in her haste to secure James's future. By claiming I was the stray and James was the heir, she had effectively locked herself out of the very fortune she was trying to steal, because once the court saw the DNA results and the forensic audit of the family history, James would be legally categorized as a stranger to the estate. The $412,000 in savings wasn't a gift for James. It was a settlement for the true Reynolds heir, and the 120-acre estate was about to experience a change in management that Virginia never saw coming in her wildest, most bitter dreams. I stood up, the leather of the chair squeaking in the quiet room, and I thanked Marcus for his time, my mind already calculating the next steps in the audit of my life. I walked out of the office and through the marble lobby, the clicking of my heels echoing off the high ceilings like a countdown, and I stepped out into the Chicago wind that was whipping through the canyons of the city. I thought about the drive back to Millbrook, the 114 miles I had traveled in silence after the reunion, and I realized that the next time I made that trip, I wouldn't be a guest or a tenant or a mistake. I would be the executor of the truth. Family isn't the blood you lie about to keep a roof over your head. It is the integrity of the foundation you build, and Virginia had built her life on a foundation of shifting sand and biological fraud. She thought she had paid a debt to Harold by raising me, but the reality was that she owed a debt to the truth that she could never possibly afford to pay. As I walked toward my 2019 Subaru, I felt a sense of liberation that was more profound than any salary increase or professional accolade I had ever received. For 33 years, I had been looking for my reflection in a house full of mirrors that were designed to distort me. But now I had a clear window into the reality of my past. I am Athena Reynolds, the daughter of Harold Reynolds, the man who built a farmhouse with his own hands and taught me that the numbers never lie even when people do. James and Virginia could keep their Raptor and their Chanel and their navy dresses for a few more days, but the audit was officially underway, and I was going to make sure that every single cent, every single acre, and every single 2x4 beam was accounted for. The betrayal at the reunion was a hook that had snagged my life and tried to pull it apart, but I had used that tension to reel in the truth. I was no longer the girl in the closet. I was the woman with the ledger, and the Reynolds family was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to bankrupt the one person who knows where all the bodies are buried. The scent of the $10 espresso lingered on my breath as I started my car, a bitter reminder that the truth often has a high price, but it was a price I was more than willing to pay to finally reclaim my own name. The following Sunday arrived with a sky the color of cold slate, a perfect, unblinking backdrop for the final audit of Virginia Reynolds' life, and I spent the morning preparing with the clinical precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. I sat in my apartment until the clock struck 9, meticulously checking the manila folders I had prepared, each one containing 15 high-resolution color copies of the DNA reports from Greer and Associates, the genetic evidence stapled to the front like a declaration of war. I chose my attire with deliberate intent, pulling on a $600 Theory power suit in a shade of midnight charcoal that made me look as sharp and unyielding as the numbers I lived by, my silhouette a stark contrast to the soft, floral deceptions Virginia usually surrounded herself with. I drove the 114 miles back to Millbrook in a state of icy calm, my hands steady on the steering wheel of my Subaru as I watched the familiar landmarks of my childhood, the rusted silos, the sprawling cornfields, the white picket fences, flicker past like scenes from a movie I had already seen. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the Reynolds estate at exactly 11 in the morning, the crunch of the stones beneath my tires sounding like the first stones of an avalanche, and I saw the collection of high-end SUVs and luxury sedans parked near the porch, signaling that Virginia's Bridge and Bible Club was in full session. This was her sanctuary, a gathering of 12 of the most influential and gossipy women in Millbrook, the self-appointed gatekeepers of local morality who spent their Sundays dissecting scripture and their neighbors over tea and finger sandwiches. I walked up the porch steps, the wood beneath my feet feeling solid and real, a reminder of the 2x4 beams my father had painstakingly leveled 40 years ago, and I pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of Earl Grey tea, warm lemon scones, and the overwhelming, suffocating cloud of Virginia's $85 Chanel No. 5, a sensory overload that usually would have made me feel like an intruder, but today it felt like the smell of a crime scene. The grand dining table was a masterpiece of social performance, laid out with the family's finest Wedgwood china, the wild strawberry pattern that cost nearly $200 per place setting, and shimmering silver spoons that I had personally polished for countless holidays. Virginia sat at the head of the table, draped in a soft cashmere twinset the color of a winter peach, looking every bit the grieving but dignified widow, until she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway like a ghost that refused to stay buried. She didn't offer a smile or a greeting. Instead, she looked at me with a cold, piercing disdain, her eyes raking over my $600 suit as if I were a smudge of dirt on her freshly steamed silk rug. "I told you to call first, Athena," she said. her voice dripping with a rehearsed exasperation that was meant to signal to her 12 guests that I was the difficult, ungrateful daughter she had so bravely endured. The women at the table, Mrs. Higgins, whose husband ran the local bank, and Mrs. Gable, the wife of the county judge, all paused with their teacups halfway to their lips, their eyes darting between us with the predatory hunger of people who lived for a scandal. I didn't sit down, and I didn't offer an apology for my intrusion, because the time for social niceties had ended the moment she stood at the Oakwood Manor and called me a mistake. I walked around the perimeter of the Wedgwood-laden table, my movements slow and deliberate, and I began handing out the manila folders to each of the 12 women as if I were a waitress delivering menus at a high-end bistro. The heavy paper of the folders made a satisfying thud as I placed them next to their delicate teacups, the sound breaking the fragile silence of the room like a hammer hitting glass. Virginia's face went from a pale peach to a ghostly, translucent white as she realized I wasn't there to beg for her forgiveness or to argue about my childhood bedroom. She saw the letterhead of Greer and Associates, and she saw the word DNA printed in bold black ink at the top of the first page. I watched as Mrs. Higgins opened her folder, her manicured thumb tracing the line that read 0.8% match between me and James, and then the line that read 12.4% match between me and my father's biological niece. The silence in the room shifted from awkward to lethal, a heavy, pressurized vacuum where the only sound was the rustle of paper as 12 of the most powerful women in Millbrook began to read the forensic proof of Virginia's 35-year-old betrayal. I stood at the foot of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, and I watched the realization dawn on their faces that the golden son, James, the man they had all watched grow up as the pride of the Reynolds name, was a biological counterfeit. Virginia tried to speak, her hand trembling as she reached for her own teacup, but the porcelain rattled against the saucer with a frantic, metallic clink that betrayed her absolute terror. "Athena, this is private. This is family business. You have no right to come into my home and do this," she hissed, but her voice lacked the sharp, commanding edge it had possessed at the reunion. I looked her directly in the eye, noting the way the fine lines around her mouth tightened as she realized the human shield she had used for 3 decades had finally turned into a mirror. "It ceased to be private family business the moment you used a Shure microphone to announce to 47 people that I was a debt you had to pay," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, hitting every corner of the house my father had built. "I wanted to make sure your friends understood the math, Mother, because as a senior CPA, I find that people often get confused by the figures when they don't have the full ledger in front of them. The math is quite simple. I am a Reynolds, and the man you are trying to give this 120-acre estate to is the son of Neil Whitfield, a man whose name I'm sure some of the ladies in this room remember from the summer of 1988. The mention of Neil Whitfield's name was the final blow. I saw Mrs. Gable's eyes widen as she looked at Virginia with a mixture of shock and a new, sharp kind of recognition, the memory of an old scandal suddenly clicking into place like a key in a lock. The Bridge and Bible Club was no longer a sanctuary. It was a jury, and Virginia was being found guilty in the very room where she had spent years carefully cultivating her image of perfection. She looked around the table at the faces of her friends, looking for a single spark of loyalty or a hand to hold, but she found only the cold, distant curiosity of people who were already mentally drafting the phone calls they would make the moment they left the driveway. I had spent 33 years being moved into a 12-square-foot hallway closet, being told I didn't belong in the light, but in this moment, the light was so bright, it was incinerating everything Virginia had worked to build. She stood up, her navy blue church dress from the previous week replaced by the peach cashmere, but she looked smaller, more fragile, as if the lies were the only thing that had been holding her upright all these years. "You think this changes anything?" she whispered, her eyes burning with a desperate, trapped kind of rage. "You think Harold didn't know?" I didn't answer her, because the folders contained more than just DNA results. At the very back, beneath the genetic charts, I had included the forensic audit of the estate's taxes and the property maintenance bills I had paid over the last 5 years, totaling over $75,000 of my own money. I was showing these women, and by extension the entire town, that the woman they admired was a financial vampire who had lived off the labor of the daughter she publicly shamed. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving the 12 folders scattered across the Wedgwood china and the Earl Grey tea, the steam from the scones still rising into the poisoned air of the dining room. As I stepped out onto the porch, I took a deep breath of the 86-degree air, which felt cleaner and lighter than it had in years, the weight of the Reynolds legacy finally shifting off my shoulders and onto the floor where it belonged. I walked to my Subaru, the $412 monthly payment a small price to pay for the freedom I felt as I started the engine and watched the Bridge and Bible Club begin to scramble toward their cars. My name is Athena, and for 11 years I balanced the books for strangers, but today I finally balanced the ledger of my own soul. Family isn't the woman who hides her sins behind a navy dress and a Bible. Family is the truth that survives when the tea goes cold and the friends go home. As I drove down the long, oak-lined driveway for the last time, I didn't look back at the farmhouse or the 120 acres, because I knew that a house built on a lie had no choice but to fall, and I was finally standing on ground that no one could ever take away from me. The silence that descended upon the dining room of the Reynolds farmhouse was not merely a lack of sound, but a heavy, suffocating weight, a burial shroud quiet that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the air as the 12 most influential women in Millbrook stared down at the black and white evidence of a 35-year-old lie. I stood at the foot of the table, my posture as rigid and uncompromising as the $600 theory power suit I wore, and I felt the ghost of my father, Harold, standing in the corners of the room he had built with his own calloused hands 40 years ago. You told everyone at the reunion that blood defines family, and you used that logic to cast me out like a piece of unwanted debris, so let us talk about the 0.8%, I said, my voice cutting through the stagnant air with the cold, clinical precision of an auditor revealing a massive embezzlement scheme. I began to walk the ladies through the technical data of the DNA reports I had distributed, pointing to the haplogroups and the specific centimorgan counts that acted as a biological map of a betrayal so deep it made the very floorboards of the house feel unstable. I explained with meticulous detail that there was no biological link whatsoever between my brother James and the man who had spent every Saturday for 4 decades maintaining this 120-acre estate, the man who had hoisted every 2x4 beam and leveled every joist to ensure his family had a stable foundation. The transition from shocked silence to visceral realization was marked by the sound of Mrs. Aldrich's sterling silver spoon hitting her Wedgwood saucer, a sharp metallic clink that sounded like a gunshot in the hushed room and caused several of the women to flinch as if they had been physically struck. I did not stop, nor did I lower my gaze from Virginia, who was sitting at the head of the table like a queen whose throne was being dismantled brick by brick in front of her most loyal subjects. I revealed to the room that while she had spent the last 3 decades calling me a burden and a debt to be paid, she was the one who had brought a secret child into Harold's bed, a biological counterfeit whom she had protected while slandering a dead man's name to cover her own tracks. I watched as Virginia tried to speak, her mouth opening in a silent gasp, but her throat physically seized with the weight of the truths she had kept suppressed since the spring of 1988. Her vocal cords failing her just as her morality had failed her family. The saintly martyr persona she had meticulously cultivated, the image of the long-suffering widow who had gracefully handled her husband's supposed indiscretion, disintegrated in a matter of seconds in front of the town's biggest gossips. Mrs. Higgins, the wife of the local bank manager, leaned in closer to the report, her glasses slipping down her nose as she whispered the name Neil Whitfield, and I saw the recognition ripple through the group like a contagion. They remembered the junior architect. They remembered the whispers that had been silenced by my father's quiet dignity. and now they were seeing the mathematical proof that their friend Virginia had played them all for fools. I felt a surge of cold, diamond-sharp clarity as I stood there, no longer the girl who was moved into a 12-square-foot hallway closet, but the woman who had finally brought the light of day into the darkest corners of this house. The $412,000 in savings she had promised to James now felt like a joke, a sum of money that would never reach his hands because the trust was governed by the very blood she had just been proven to have betrayed. I looked at the Earl Grey tea cooling in the delicate porcelain cups and the lemon scones that no one would ever eat, and I realized that the social hierarchy of Millbrook was shifting in real time, the power dynamic in the room tilting so sharply that the air itself felt different. Virginia's hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning the same ghostly white as the lace runner I had bought her for her last birthday. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and a primordial, trapped rage, but she couldn't find a single word to counter the percentages printed in high-resolution color on the pages in front of her friends. I reminded the ladies that while I was working 60-hour weeks as a senior CPA to pay the $14,000 property taxes on this land, James was driving a $78,000 Ford Raptor bought with the inheritance of a man who wasn't even his father. I laid out the financial trail as clearly as I had laid out the genetic one, showing them that the woman they admired for her strength was actually a parasite who had fed off the labor of the daughter she publicly shamed. The irony was a jagged blade. I was the only true Reynolds in the room, the only one who carried Harold's DNA and his relentless obsession with the truth. Yet I was the one who had been treated like a squatter in my own legacy. As the realization settled into the bones of every woman at that table, the whispers began, low and frantic, a buzzing sound that signaled the end of Virginia's reign in this town. They weren't looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with the cold, judgmental eyes of people who had been lied to, people who had invited a deceiver into their homes and their hearts. I stood my ground at the foot of the table, my heels firmly planted on the hardwood floor my father had laid, and I felt a sense of completion that no audit or financial success could ever provide. The 120-acre estate was no longer a prison of secrets. It was a property awaiting its rightful owner, and the farmhouse with its beams and joists seemed to sigh in relief as the weight of the deception was finally lifted. Virginia's eyes darted toward the door, perhaps hoping that James would walk in and save her. But I knew he was likely miles away, oblivious to the fact that his Velocity blue truck and his seed money startups were all built on a foundation that had just been vaporized. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, and looked at the 12 women who represented the social fabric of Millbrook, their faces a gallery of shock, disgust, and morbid fascination. "My name is Athena Reynolds," I said, my voice steady and low, "and for 33 years I have been the tenant in this family, but today the audit is closed and the accounts are finally settled." I didn't need to stay for the aftermath, for the frantic explanations Virginia would try to offer once her voice returned, or for the way the ladies would scramble to their luxury cars to spread the news through the county like wildfire. I had done what my father couldn't do. I had protected the integrity of the Reynolds name by exposing the person who had been dragging it through the mud for decades. I turned away from the table, my theory suit rustling as I walked toward the door, leaving the folders and the DNA charts and the shattered remains of a mother's reputation behind me. As I stepped out onto the porch, the 86-degree air felt like a benediction, the scent of the countryside no longer tainted by the smell of Chanel No. 5 or the cloying sweetness of Earl Grey tea. I walked to my 2019 Subaru, the car I had paid for with my own sweat and my own late nights, and I realized that the $412 monthly payment was the sound of my own independence. I looked back at the house one last time, at the white paint and the wraparound porch, and I saw the curtain in the dining room twitch as one of the ladies looked out, her phone already pressed to her ear. The trap had been sprung, the truth had been told, and the 114 miles back to the city would be the shortest drive of my life, because I was no longer carrying the weight of a family that didn't exist. Family isn't the blood you use as a weapon. It is the truth you are brave enough to hold in your hands when the world goes burial shroud quiet. I started the engine, the digital dashboard lighting up with the familiar symbols of a life I had built for myself, and I felt a profound sense of alignment with the man who had built that house. Harold Reynolds didn't raise a mistake. He raised an auditor, a woman who knew how to find the errors in a ledger and the lies in a life, and he had given me the tools to reclaim everything that was rightfully mine. As I drove away, the gravel spraying beneath my tires, I knew that the next time I saw that 120-acre estate, I wouldn't be looking at it from the hallway closet. I would be looking at it from the head of the table, where the true heir finally belonged. The debt was paid, the blood was proven, and for the first time in 33 years, the Reynolds ledger was perfectly, beautifully balanced. I felt a cold, sharp peace settle over me as the farmhouse vanished in my rearview mirror, knowing that a house built on a lie cannot stand, but a woman built on the truth is absolutely invincible. The fallout from that Sunday afternoon at the Bridge and Bible Club was not a slow crumble but a swift and surgical demolition of a 35-year-old empire built on the shifting sands of biological fraud and emotional manipulation. As a senior CPA, I have always understood that once the integrity of a primary document is compromised, the entire ledger becomes a liability, and in the eyes of the probate court in Millbrook, James's 0.8% DNA match was the ultimate audit failure. Because James was not Harold's biological son, the legal mechanisms of my father's original will, a document he had signed with a steady hand 40 years ago, automatically activated a bloodline clause that excluded any non-biological descendants from the primary inheritance. This meant that James, the golden boy who had coasted through life on a $78,000 Ford Raptor and a series of $115,000 failed startups, suddenly found himself with absolutely zero claim to the 50% of the estate that had been governed by my father's portion of the marital assets. I, the daughter who had been moved into a 12-square-foot hallway closet and treated like a temporary tenant, was now the legally recognized majority owner of the entire 120-acre Reynolds estate, including the farmhouse, the equipment, and the $412,000 in savings that Virginia had tried to use as a parting gift for her counterfeit heir. The speed at which James's curated life of luxury disintegrated was a testament to how little of it he actually owned, as his legal debts began to mount with the terrifying velocity of an unchecked interest rate. Within 6 months of the DNA revelation, the Velocity Blue Ford F-150 Raptor was gone, sold at a significant loss to cover the retainer fees for a legal team that eventually told him he had no case against the ironclad biological evidence I had presented. He went from cruising the back roads of the county with the arrogance of a king to navigating the reality of a $3,000 used sedan and a mountain of credit card debt that I would no longer be quietly paying off through the family accounts. Virginia's descent was even more stark, as the community she had manipulated for decades turned its back on her with a coldness that mirrored the way she had treated me for 33 years. The woman who once draped herself in $300 Navy church dresses and $85 Chanel No. 5 was forced to vacate the farmhouse after a court-ordered partition of the property, eventually settling into a 450-square-foot assisted living suite on the outskirts of town. It is a sterile, cramped space with beige walls and a single window overlooking a parking lot, a far cry from the wraparound porch and the mahogany interiors of the home Harold built, and she lives there in a silence that is only broken by the occasional visit from a social worker, ignored by the Bridge and Bible Club members who once treated her like a saintly martyr. I kept the farm, not out of a desire for revenge, but because every 2x4 beam and every joist in that house is a physical record of the man who actually loved me, and I refuse to let his labor be a casualty of Virginia's deception. I walk the 120 acres every evening now, my boots crunching on the same gravel I once thought I was being banished from, and I look up at the ancient white oaks that have stood as silent witnesses to the Reynolds history long before I was born. The property taxes, which still run exactly $14,000 a year, are paid from the Reynolds estate account that I now manage with the same meticulous precision I apply to my $142,000 salary at the firm in the city. I have moved my things out of the hallway closet and back into the primary bedrooms, replacing the gilded portraits of James with the photographs of my father that I rescued from the dust, ensuring that the man who built this sanctuary is finally the only one whose presence defines it. There is a profound, diamond-sharp peace in knowing that the $412,000 in savings is being used to restore the barn and preserve the land, rather than being squandered on the whims of a man who didn't share the blood or the work ethic of the Reynolds line. The farmhouse no longer smells of Chanel No. 5 or the cloying scent of Earl Grey tea. It smells of cedar, fresh wax, and the clean, honest scent of the countryside that I had been denied for so long. I still work my 60-hour weeks because the grind is part of who I am, but I no longer do it to subsidize a lie or to earn the approval of people who saw me as a transaction. My 2019 Subaru Outback sits in the driveway next to the heavy machinery my father used, a symbol of the independence I bought with my own sweat and my own refusal to break under the weight of a 35-year-old betrayal. Every time I look at the legal deed to the 120 acres, seeing my name listed as the primary executor and owner, I am reminded that while truth can be a destructive force, it only destroys what was never meant to stand in the first place. I have reclaimed my father's honor from the mud where Virginia tried to bury it, proving to the 47 relatives and the 12 women of the Bridge and Bible Club that Harold Reynolds was exactly the man he appeared to be. A man of integrity, whose only mistake was trusting a woman who didn't know the meaning of the word. Family is not the blood you share with people who treat you like a burden. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out. And in the end, it was just me and the memory of my father standing on this land. I have spent 33 years looking for a seat at a table that was rigged against me, but now I have built a table of my own, one where the numbers always balance and the secrets have all been audited out of existence. The chasm that once divided the Reynolds house has been filled with the solid earth of reality, and the 120 acres feel larger and more vibrant than they ever did when I was living in the shadows of James's unearned golden glow. Virginia's 450-square-foot suite is her own personal hallway closet, a space defined by the narrowness of her own choices, while I have the horizon and the white oaks and the legacy of a man who built things to last. The debt that Virginia said I owed to Harold was a lie. The only debt I ever owed was to myself, to have the courage to use the truth to dismantle the lies that were killing me from the inside out. As the sun sets over the farmhouse, casting long golden shadows across the porch where my father once sat, I feel a sense of alignment that is more valuable than any inheritance or any bank account. I am Athena Reynolds, the daughter of a builder and a woman of the ledger, and I have finally finished the work my father started 40 years ago by ensuring that the foundation of this family is level and true. The audit of my life is complete, the accounts are settled, and the 120 acres are finally at rest under the care of the only person who ever truly valued them. I realize that the truth doesn't just destroy, it clears the ground so that something real can grow in the place of a facade. And as I look out at the land that is now mine by right and by blood, I know that I have finally come home. A house built on a lie cannot stand, but a woman built on the truth is a fortress that no amount of betrayal can ever hope to breach. The Reynolds name is no longer a mask for an architect's secret. It is a testament to the daughter who fought her way out of a closet to claim her place at the head of the table. Family isn't what you are told you have to accept. Family is the truth you are brave enough to build for yourself when everyone else is trying to tear you down. The ledger is balanced, the blood is proven, and for the first time in 33 years, I am breathing air that doesn't taste like someone else's secrets.